Around 5,000 years ago, one of the largest and most powerful empires in history emerges on the banks of the Nile. Ancient Egypt. Monumental temples, tombs and metropolises bear witness to the power of this fascinating civilization. Yet Egyptian culture is also considered strange and mysterious to this day. International researchers explain the world of the godlike pharaohs and the everyday life of their subjects. The Egyptian empire endured for 3,000 years. What is the secret of success of this advanced civilization on the Nile? A narrow green ribbon in the middle of endless desert. The Nile, the lifeline of Egypt. Its water transforms parched soils into productive farmland. The first houses and settlements emerge from its mud.
It was the mud of Egypt that really made it successful.
The history of Egypt is the history of the Nile. Yet our story begins in the Sahara. The Arabs call it As-Sahra al-Kubra, the Great Desert, or Bahr bila Ma, the sea without water. Throughout the year, extreme drought prevails. In summer, temperatures rise up to 60 degrees Celsius, a landscape of extremes. Yet even here, people live. Nomadic desert dwellers. Most of them are Arabs, Berbers, or Tuareg. You meet them mainly on the fringes of the dry desert, where they raise cattle, goats, and sheep. Their homeland stretches from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. A desert continent, 9 million square kilometers of nothing but sand, stone, and rubble. Life is found here only at a few waterholes. There are 5 such oases in the Egyptian Sahara today, green islands in the middle of a hostile, barren landscape. A plateau in the extreme southwest of Egypt, however, suggests that the Sahara was not always a desert. Underway in one of the driest regions in the world. No rain has fallen here for decades. The Gulf Kabir Plateau rises some 300 meters from the surrounding desert. In Wadi Sura, the Valley of Images, traces of the early days of sedentary man have been found. Drawings on rock overhangs more than 8,000 years old. Stone Age people left their handprints here. Hidden at the foot of the plateau is a cave. The site was discovered only about 20 years ago. Its rock walls are covered all over with figures. Men hunting, children playing. They show that back then, antelopes, gazelles, and giraffes must still have lived in the Sahara. However, the cave is named after these grotesque figures. Headless monsters whose meaning still puzzles researchers today.
Most of them are so-called mixed creatures. To some, they seem ape-like or elephant-like. They have no heads, but a tail. So they may be mystical creatures that we can't identify. The Cave of Monsters stands out because it's by far the largest rock art site anywhere, with an estimated 8,000 individual figures. What's special is that there's a huge number that represent humans.
Yet how do these paintings full of life fit in with the desert that surrounds them? Another cave, also on the Gilf Kebir Plateau, provides a clue. The Cave of the Swimmers. It contains representations of swimming people. The oldest are more than 10,000 years old. Swimming people in a dust-dried desert? The petroglyphs are not the only evidence that people once lived here thousands of years ago, and that the environment must have looked very different. A few years ago, prehistorian Heiko Riemer and his team surveyed the entire area around the cave and discovered something amazing. Layers of ancient sediment. They are clear traces of a lake in the middle of the desert. In fact, about 10,000 years ago, the landscape at the foot of Gilf Kebir looked much greener.
It's what we call a dry savanna. That means very low tree cover, typically of acacias and tamarisk. During precipitation periods, a green area forms very quickly, especially in the sand plains, so there'll be meadows which can be used as food supplies.
Where there is desert now, there was lush life for thousands of years. Huge herds once roamed the fertile plains of North Africa. Model calculations have unraveled the secret of the Green Sahara. Whether it rains in the Sahara or not depends on the monsoon wind. And about 12,000 years ago, the climate of North Africa changes. It's the end of an ice age. The northern hemisphere gets more solar heat, since at the time the inclination of the Earth's axis is particularly large. And that leads to monsoon winds from the sea into the land. They bring humid sea air into the Sahara and allow the desert to blossom. Alas, this blooming does not last forever. From 5000 BC onwards, the inclination of the Earth's axis to the sun slowly reduces again. The monsoon rains become weaker, and not only the vegetation retreats.
The climate change we're looking at here is due to long-term processes that may have been going on for 2,000–3,000 years, if not longer. Yet, as we get ever more precise data, we see that there have been staircase-like jumps in this development. In other words, there were moments when things were moving relatively quickly. And that's exactly when the first groups of dwellers from the marginal areas withdrew, first to the oases and then also to the Nile Valley.
Vor allem aber dann schließlich auch ins Niltal.
On a narrow, fertile strip along the Nile, the climate refugees find a new home. A green paradise, where a different kind of life begins for the nomadic desert dwellers. Instead of wandering around as hunter-gatherers, they now practice agriculture and cattle breeding. And fishing, of course. Settling down is the prerequisite for the emergence of the first advanced civilization around the Mediterranean. And the Egyptians know exactly to whom they owe this new life of prosperity. Ancient reliefs show, even for life in the hereafter, the ancient Egyptians could imagine nothing more beautiful than the Nile, which gave them everything they needed. The images of fishermen and hunters are painted blessings for a good life after death. Fish, crocodiles and hippos cavort in the water. Among the reeds and papyrus bushes glide the boats of goose and duck hunters. On the banks, among rushes and lotus flowers, numerous birds are nesting, and they're home to small and large mammals, butterflies and grasshoppers.
The Nile may not have been such a lifeline before people moved in from the west. It may have been not so hospitable for farming, but it really took off just about the time that people were moving in from the Western Sahara. So it was a happy coincidence where the grasslands are drying up, the lakes are drying up in the Western Sahara, but silt is beginning to be deposited by the Nile, by its annual flooding, in the Nile Valley. This is what made farming possible in the Nile Valley. This is what made Egyptian civilization possible.
Every year at the same time, the river overflows its banks and spreads its fertile black mud. The Nile flood in summer also marks the beginning of the new year in Egypt. Achet is the time of the flood, the first of the 3 ancient Egyptian seasons. It's followed by Peret, the rising of the seed, which ripens magnificently thanks to the abundance of water the soil has absorbed. Then Shemu, the time of heat and harvest, when the sun-drenched fields on the banks yield rich crops. The waters of the Nile turn the alluvial floodplains into one of the most fertile landscapes in the world, a life in harmony with the Nile. Until the water comes again, and the mud carried along on its long journey. The mixture of clay and mud isn't only a beneficial fertilizer for the fields. The Egyptians also use it as building material for their dwellings. Bricks can be made with it using simple wooden molds. Sand and straw are added for stability. Then the bricks are air-dried. It's an economical and sustainable method of construction, as the Nile constantly provides for replenishment.
It was the mud of Egypt that really made it successful, because you made your pots with it, you made your mud brick and your houses with it, you made your palaces with it, you made defensive walls with it. So really, the mud of Egypt is its making. And in fact, the name of Egypt for the ancient Egyptians is Kemet, which means black land. And that is because the color of the soil that was deposited after the flood was so black and dense, and this is what gave Egypt its name.
Mud bricks remained the #1 building material of the Egyptians for thousands of years. As early as 5,000 years ago, most of the dwellings in the cities were made of the mud of the Nile. Only what is meant to last forever is built of solid stone, like the pyramids of Giza, or the magnificent temple complexes in Luxor, highlights of Egyptian stone architecture. The ancient historian Herodotus called Egypt a gift of the Nile. The Nile is the pride of the Egyptians, a gift of the gods, exclusively for their chosen people who are supposed to live a life of plenty. Accordingly, the gods of the Nile are worshipped with zeal. The god of the Nile flood is Hapi. He makes the fields fertile and is thus depicted as an obese man with hanging breasts. Then there is the creator goddess, Tueris. She appears as a pregnant hippopotamus with a crocodile head and lion's legs. The crocodile-headed god Sobek is considered the embodiment of the waters of the Nile. He also rules over the fertile Fayum region. The goddess Satis, with 2 antelope horns and the crown of Upper Egypt on her head, is worshipped as the giver of the Nile water. Together with Khnum and Anuket, she forms the so-called divine triad of Elephantine. For here, on the island of Elephantine, is supposed to be the source of the Nile, according to Egyptian belief. Even if people actually knew that the Nile rises much further south, outside Egypt. A relief in the temple of the goddess Satis testifies to the pragmatism of the ancient Egyptians. To resolve the contradiction, a member of the trio of gods is given a special headdress. It's supposed to guarantee that the ancient Egyptian gods also have power over the part of the Nile outside Egypt.
Ancient Egyptian gods normally have only 1 or 2 feathers in their crowns. But when we have a crown which has lots of feathers, this is an indication that we're dealing with a god that has a southern connection. So here, the goddess Anuket is a goddess that gives for the ancient Egyptian a control over the Nile beyond the southern borders, beyond the first cataract.
But where exactly is the origin of Egypt's lifeline? The huge river has 2 headwaters. The so-called White Nile rises in the mountains of Rwanda and Burundi and flows north through Lake Victoria. The Blue Nile rises in the Ethiopian highlands. In Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, the White and the Blue Nile become one. The Egyptians celebrate the annual Nile flood with a special ritual. When the flood has reached a certain level, the pharaoh punctures the dams, and the water can pour out onto the fields. The ceremonial openings of the canals are attested to more than 5,000 years ago.
How did this happen? How does kingship arise? It probably happens because for all periods, Egypt was organized by households. Households are like seeds, and basically the expansion of kingship was one household and its proprietor becoming more and more dominant, taking more and more villages, and even whole other governorates, whole other districts under his control. Throughout time, the kingship emerged as the household of households, which is what the word pharaoh means. It means the great the greatest house.
The annually recurring Nile flood guarantees prosperity and the wealth of the country. It drenches the fields with water and transforms the land into a fertile Garden of Eden. Over time, the Egyptians developed ever more sophisticated irrigation systems to supply their fields with sufficient water all year round. Farmers rely on what is known as basin irrigation. With the help of sluices and mechanical pumps, a finely branched canal system directs the Nile flood to where it's most urgently needed. Even today, Egyptian farmers irrigate parts of their fields with this time-honored method. When the water supply is assured, Egypt does well. Yet, if the floods fail, drought, hunger and misery must be expected. In the Middle Kingdom, massive construction projects are designed to ensure a continuous water supply. Under Pharaoh Amenemhet II, around 1850 BC, the natural course of the Nile branch called Bahr Yusuf is converted into a canal. The Joseph Canal, 15 kilometers long and 5 meters deep, follows the natural gradient of the valley and connects the Nile with the Fayoum Basin, southwest of Cairo. A gigantic irrigation system is created, with mighty barrage dams and drainage canals. The diversion of Nile water into the Fayoum Basin also creates a huge artificial lake, Lake Moeris, a water reservoir with a capacity at the time of 114 cubic kilometers. It fills from August to December through the Joseph Canal and empties again from March to May, so that beginning in April, summer crops can be grown on the lake's brine on an area of 15,000 hectares. The marshy Fayoum becomes the granary of Egypt, an oasis in the middle of a barren desert. To coordinate the deployment of skilled workers and materials, however, another achievement of Egypt's advanced civilization is needed: a well-functioning administration.
Ancient Egypt did not merely consist of Upper and Lower Egypt, and then perhaps the desert regions. The country was subdivided into many individual provinces or districts, which we today call nomes. They were the lower or local strata of the administration of the individual province. Only this way could the additional yield produced by agriculture be distributed to the various areas of the country.
The Egyptians knew the nomes as sepat, or later nomos. As early as the First Dynasty, the elongated country is divided into smaller administrative units. They're located on both sides of the Nile and extend over 30 to 40 kilometers. Their Egyptian names are derived from the gods worshipped in the respective area. There are 42 nomes in total, 22 in the Delta, 20 in Upper Egypt. Once established, they remained valid until Greco-Roman times, that is, for millennia.
The leaders of these districts, the so-called district princes, were of course supposed to be loyal to the ruling house and to the king. Yet in certain critical phases, they first and foremost minded their own interests. In a way, this is comparable to the governors of individual federal states today, who sometimes challenge or even defy the central government. It would have been very similar back then.
The administration also sets taxes based on the water level of the Nile. On the island of Elephantine, there are several so-called Nilometers, which are used to measure the height of the annual Nile flood. The oldest of them is located near the Satis Temple, a staircase with a marking scale. But there are other models.
All around the Nile, there were Nilometers. These Nilometers were connected with the Nile with pipes, and the water would be gathered in small rooms. And in these rooms, the level of the Nile water could be very well estimated and measured, and accordingly, the taxes for people would be estimated and would be set. More water meant a more rich outcome of the agriculture would mean higher taxes, and the other way around. So this was really important for the administration in ancient Egypt.
Egyptian officials are powerful. They keep order and collect taxes, mostly in kind. But even Egyptian administration would not have worked without another groundbreaking invention: writing.
Writing emerged even before the Old Kingdom. The background was quite simply an economic one. If I want to bring certain goods in some kind of containers from one place to another, the goods must be recorded on the containers. Where do they come from, and who do they belong to? That can be achieved by a limited number of rather basic signs. However, very quickly, this writing system developed into something completely different.
For the ancient Egyptians, hieroglyphs are words of God. They're used mainly for religious purposes, and are said to have a magical meaning. The painting of the elaborate ideograms is practiced on wooden tablets like these. They're covered with a white layer of stucco, so they can be used again and again. For everyday correspondence, however, the Egyptians used the so-called hieratic, where the hieroglyphic characters are simplified into strokes and groups of strokes. Papyrus and parchment are so valuable back then that people prefer to use shards of clay for everyday notes. In the late period, another form of writing appears, demotic. Its most striking feature compared to hieratic is the use of numerous abbreviations. The last ancient Egyptian script form is Coptic. It combines Greek letters with demotic symbols. The ancient Egyptians preserved their very special relationship to writing and images over the millennia.
When you see an ancient Egyptian tomb or a temple, you're struck by the amount of hieroglyphs as well as pictures that are on the walls. And for the Egyptians, both things were very important. And in fact, a lot of their art is just blown up hieroglyphs, but for the people who are not literate. So the idea can be conveyed without people being able to read. And so the Egyptians also believed by writing it down, it was made real somehow. So these images, as well as these words that are written down, had a huge amount of power. And by writing them on temples and tombs, they were real. Whatever they said would happen. And also, if you spoke them, they would get added potency. So there was a lot of magic and power in the word.
However, in modern times, this magic seems forever lost, since no one can make sense of the hieroglyphs anymore, until this chunk of dark grey granodiorite is found. It's 1.12 meters high, 76 centimeters wide, and weighs 762 kilograms. How did this fragment of an ancient Egyptian stele help unlock the secret of the ancient script? It's mid-July 1799. French soldiers are building a fortification near the town of Rashid, also known as Rosetta. Engineer Lieutenant Pierre Bouchard immediately realizes the significance of this chance find. The Rosetta Stone, as it's called after its location, sends international experts into a frenzy. What makes it so unique is its trilingual inscription, in Egyptian hieroglyphics, in Demotic, and in ancient Greek. 3 times the same content. And thus, finally, the hoped-for clue to translate the hieroglyphs of the ancient Egyptians. For 23 years, experts pore over the inscription, alas without much success, until a young linguist, Jean-François Champollion, solves the riddle of the hieroglyphs in 1822. Champollion recognizes that hieroglyphic signs also stand for sounds and can be read like an alphabetic script. First, the Frenchman deciphers the name of the pharaoh Ptolemy. The 7 hieroglyphs stand for 10 Greek letters, yet that's only the beginning. By cracking the millennia-old code, Champollion opens up whole new possibilities for exploring ancient Egypt. Thanks to the countless preserved papyri, scientists can explore ancient Egyptian civilization. Even today, new documents continue to be discovered. Texts written by the elite of the country, mostly priests or officials. Future civil servants are taught to write from childhood. They also acquire specialized knowledge necessary for handling matters of economy, such as the drafting of contracts. And they learn the basics of mathematics, enabling them to calculate areas and volumes. In ancient Egypt, there's a civil servant for every task. More than 2,000 different official titles have been handed down.
The bureaucracy in ancient Egypt is quite strong since the unification of Egypt. With time, the officials, especially the high officials, gain more and more power and prestige. Some of them start to have really big and prestigious tombs.
In some of these burial chambers, statues have been found. High Egyptian officials like to have themselves immortalized as scribes. An emphasized obesity seems to have been a must in these portrayals. The scribe's chest appears almost feminine, and his belly has several folds, both attributes of power and wealth. A person's actual appearance, however, cannot be deduced from this. The coffin of Idu II. The remains of this high official are considered the best researched mummy from the Old Kingdom. During his lifetime, he was responsible for importing wood from Lebanon, a most valuable item. Idu's face has been reconstructed by forensic specialists in Germany. His head, modeled in the computer, is reworked sculpturally. The result of the elaborate facial reconstruction is amazingly realistic, including a contemporary hairstyle of braided pigtails.
Civil servants play a very important role in ancient Egypt, from the Old Kingdom to the Greco-Roman period. They are the ones who ensure that the state functions properly. The Great Pyramids, for example, could not have been built without this highly efficient administration. So without the officials and the priests, ancient Egypt would not have been the civilization we know today.
Officials are needed to divide the fields or to count citizens, livestock and crop yields. They collect taxes, using force if need be. They're responsible for protecting caravans through the desert. And on the river, they hunt down smugglers. The Nile is Egypt's most important trade route. Without it, the centrally controlled supply of the population would hardly have been feasible. Large quantities of grain, as well as stones for the construction of temples and pyramids, have to be transported. Officials and common travelers want to reach their destinations quickly and easily. In ancient Egypt, all this is only possible by water. The building material for the first boats grows on the banks of the Nile. Reed is a particularly light and easily bendable material. It's dried and tied into bundles, then bent into shape. A roof made of straw offers protection from the sun. The rudders are attached to wooden poles. This type of boat can even be traced back to pre-dynastic times. At the same time, the first wooden boats appear. Their construction follows the same principle. Instead of reed or papyrus, wooden planks are tied together with ropes made of palm or papyrus fibers. These wooden boats are sufficiently stable so that they can carry even granite blocks weighing several tons. The Egyptians are masters of shipbuilding. The Nile thus becomes a superhighway connecting the country and its people.
The Nile basically sufficed as a transport artery for the whole length of the country. So the way to get around in ancient Egypt was by boat. And so the Nile was a very busy artery. The Nile not only brought life to Egypt in terms of bringing the silt that allowed agriculture to happen, but the Nile brought a means to get around the country and unify the whole nation.
In fact, wheeled vehicles hardly play a role in pharaonic Egypt. One of the rare exceptions, ox carts used to transport ships over land. Egyptian boats can be disassembled into their component parts if necessary, and reassembled at their destination, plank by plank. In warfare, this can provide decisive advantages. Behind this is an ingenious plug-in system. There's not a single piece of metal. A few wooden nails ensure that the parts stay firmly together, even in stormy weather. Yet the Nile also has its pitfalls. Rapids, so-called cataracts, are like small waterfalls. Here the current becomes very fast and dangerous. As a rule, however, the river is navigable all year round, over a length of almost 900 kilometers between the Nile Delta and the first cataract near Aswan. Shipping traffic is possible in both directions. There are corresponding hieroglyphs for the terms downstream and upstream. One ship with mast down for traveling with the current, one with sail hoisted for traveling against the current. Whether underway with muscle or wind power, the cataracts are the biggest obstacle to navigation. Trade goods and raw materials such as gold, copper or wood have to be unloaded here and reloaded beyond the rapids. Special transport roads are built to bypass the cataracts. A slipway consists of two embankments heaped up on the sides. Round wooden planks are laid across the direction of transport. A thick layer of moist mud is crucial. Even larger ships can thus be pulled with comparative ease. Despite all adversities, the Nile is the main traffic artery in ancient Egypt.
Ancient Egypt was a hydraulic society, so to speak, since everything was oriented towards the Nile. That concerns agriculture as well as traffic. Water also divides the living from the dead in a certain sense, as the dead are usually buried on the west side of the river.
The Nile also dominates the belief system of the ancient Egyptians. When high dignitaries die, they are ferried to the west, where the royal tombs are located. A pyramid serves as a kind of staircase for the ruler to ascend to heaven. And as he needs a boat in the afterlife, complete ships are buried at the foot of the pyramids, so-called sunbarks. The slightly curved side walls of the pits follow the shapes of the slender boat hulls that were probably once stored there. The actual barks, however, have decayed. Other than in the vicinity of the Khufu Pyramid on the Giza Plateau. Here in 1954, archaeologists discovered two boat pits, still intact and untouched. For about 10 years, an Egyptian-Japanese team has been working on the recovery of the second, so-called Khufu barge. Alas, microorganisms seem to have entered the tomb during the first drilling. The condition of the wood is worrisome. When dismantled, the boat is like a gigantic puzzle. So to what degree the reconstruction will resemble the original remains to be seen. The first Khufu bark is 4,600 years old and would still be functional today. However, it was never intended for the waters of the Nile.
For the Egyptians, the sun god moved across the sky in a boat, in a bark. And during the day, of course, you can see him. But at night, too, he had to go through the night sort of sky or river on a bark. And this was a much more dangerous journey for the sun god than the daytime journey, because the bark was always being attacked by different enemies of the sun. And so the night journey, he had to fight them off. And the bark was not only a method of conveyance, but it was almost like a warship to make sure that he was safe and that the sun would rise and the world would continue the next day.
No other culture has focused on death and the afterlife as much as that of the ancient Egyptians. This is also shown by the different types of tombs throughout their 4,000-year history. The first Egyptian kings are buried in underground chambers. A mound of sand covers the tomb, symbolizing the mound that emerged from the primordial flood when the world was created. Then, in the Old Kingdom, mastabas became popular for high officials. Stone-built burial chambers below ground, topped by a rectangular stone structure. It was long thought that the first pyramid began as a mastaba and was then expanded into a rectangular, stepped pyramid. In fact, the creation myth of the primordial mound was probably the model for the pyramid builders. The result is architecture imperfection. Then, in the New Kingdom, shafts carved deep into the rock lead to the final resting place of the rulers, most famously in the Valley of the Kings. During the late period, temple tombs become